Can Frank Turek justify objective morality? Or is it, like with so much else that he spouts, just a word game, a bald rationalization to justify why he thinks he's right, even though he never is? Let's find out. Welcome back to another Q&A session with Frank Turek, where Frank answers a question from a man named Marcus about objective morality, and he does it very, very poorly. But most things Frank says are poor, so I guess that's hardly a surprise. This is why objective morality is just wishful thinking. It doesn't stand up to a moment's critical evaluation. But Frank is too busy waving his arms around to be able to see through the absurdity of his own beliefs. Maybe he ought to try listening to himself and realizing just how ridiculous it all is. But anyhow, on with the show.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. What's your name?
Adjust that a little bit. My name's Marcus.
Hey, Marcus.
So earlier you said that our moral standards are based off something that we don't set ourselves as something that is above us. So how would you explain that societies outside of the United States, and even some within the United States, have a moral standard that's okay with some things that are what we see as less than or way below what we set a standard to drop down to?
Yeah, excellent question, Marcus.
Yes, it is an excellent question that we all know Frank will have an asinine answer to. But as usual with these things, I'll answer the question before letting Frank make a complete fool of himself. The truth that Frank doesn't understand, is that morality isn't objective, it's subjective. And I wanted to explain what I mean by that. Objectivity means the lack of bias, a lack of prejudice, something that exists beyond human opinion or decision, something that is simply true regardless of what we might think about it. Gravity is objective. It doesn't matter whether we like it or not. The force of gravity is 9.8 meters per second squared. Our views have no impact on that whatsoever. So when I talk about objective morality, that's exactly what I mean by it, and exactly what the religious mean as well. They think morals come from God, and nothing humans can do can change those moral views. Except they don't understand that if God can change morality, if God can come up with morality, then God's own subjectivity renders those moral views subjective. Truly objective morals could not, by definition, come from any mind. They must exist, like gravity, entirely apart from rational, intelligent decision. Religion just moves the goalpost. Religious morality is not objective. It is just as subjective as what we see in the world around us. But let's see Frank try to get out of that.
Let's just use the Nazi culture against the Allied culture back in World War II. The Nazis thought it was fine to kill Jews, homosexuals, gypsies, these kinds of people, because they wanted to create the super race.
Interesting how he ignored killing atheists, huh? Just as it will be interesting that he fails to recognize that the Nazis were Christians and that Hitler believed that God told him to murder the Jews. Funny how that kind of stuff never comes up in Christian apologetics, huh?
We look at that and go, well, that's wrong. And so in order for us to convict the Nazis at the Nuremberg trial, we said to them, you shouldn't have done that.
Exactly. But how do we know that they shouldn't have done that? Well, let's be honest. We won the war, we had all the power, and we got to say. We applied our morality to a situation we were in control of, just like had Germany won, they would have done the exact same thing against countries that protected the Jews, declaring them immoral for having not recognized that Aryans were the master race. But I'm sure Frank will get this wrong, won't he?
And they said, we were following the orders of our government. And we came back and said, you had a moral obligation to disobey an immoral law. Why? Because there's a moral law, international law, what Thomas Jefferson called in the Declaration of Independence nature's law, what the Apostle Paul calls the law written on the heart in Romans chapter 2. That law is God's nature.
He just keeps getting farther and farther away from reality, doesn't he? Because he starts out with international law, which is a subjective standard agreed to by various nations, particularly various militarily and economically strong nations, which says these are the standards that we're going to hold everyone accountable to, whether you agree to it or not, because we have the power and you don't. And then he goes off into natural law, which I've addressed elsewhere before, and finally into a silly book of mythology, which doesn't actually mean a thing. He had it right to begin with, then he went right off the reservation.
And the only way to adjudicate between these two laws, say the Allied culture and the Nazi culture, was to say that the Allied culture was closer to this law than the Nazi culture.
Which is not how it works at all. As I said before, if the Nazis had won and put the Allies on trial at their own version of Nuremberg, they could have made the exact same argument, and it would have meant just as much. We want this, therefore we're going to claim this is true. But wanting isn't the same as having, and if you want to talk objectivity, which is supposedly why we're here, then you have to recognize that you have to back up your claims with evidence. You would have to show that there's an objective morality in the first place, then show how your own moral views coincide with that objective morality to make you more correct, for lack of a better word, than the other guys. And Frank can't do that.
So when we say that there's got to be a standard beyond, we're not implying that everybody's necessarily going to agree with that standard, or we're not implying that everybody's going to behave according to that standard. But what we are saying is we can identify when a culture goes wrong because they deviate from the standard of God's nature.
The standard that you claim God's nature has. For that God you can't prove is real. So I wanted to explain why this kind of thing happens, and it really comes down to human laziness. Morality is hard. Justifying morality is time-consuming, and keeping it all straight, nobody wants to do that. So people simply declare that morality is objective, that whatever they say morality actually is, so they don't have to think about it much. They just have to apply whatever the standards of their own culture happen to be and declare anyone else who deviates from that as immoral monsters. And it doesn't matter where you place that supposed objective morality. You can do it as natural law, used by a lot of libertarians and those people. You can believe some imaginary man in the sky did it. Whatever. It's just a way to address the inherent intellectual laziness of humanity. And people like Frank are proud of that laziness. Imagine that.
So the moral law or the moral argument doesn't depend on everybody being moral. It doesn't even depend on everybody agreeing what is moral.
It just means that I get to decide what I think is moral and insisting that God will kick your ass if you disagree. I'm not sure that's a convincing argument.
All the moral law is saying is if there's one thing morally right out there and one thing morally wrong, there has to be a God.
And that's stupid, because there's nothing inherently morally right and nothing inherently morally wrong. Is it morally wrong when a cheetah kills a gazelle? Of course not. But if God is some objective moral lawgiver, why shouldn't those moral laws apply to everything? And because cheetahs didn't sin, non-sentient animals don't have that capacity, then why should they be immoral? In fact, why do animals die if, according to creationists and religious lunatics, before sin, everyone lived forever and no one ate meat? But that takes looking at stuff rationally and not just rationalizing away reality when it becomes inconvenient. And that seems to be something that Frank is incapable of.
So if it's wrong, say, to torture babies for fun, God exists. If it's right to love babies, God exists.
But you haven't proven either of those. All we can say is that in our culture, in most cultures in fact, torturing babies for fun is seen as wrong. It doesn't mean that it's objectively wrong. It means that we have seen fit to classify it as wrong. And before anyone says, well, that means anyone can do anything they want because nothing is really right or wrong. That's not how society operates. Society decides collectively what it will allow and what it will punish. And you, as a member of society, are held accountable to those codes of conduct, whether you personally agree to them or not. It's why the sovereign citizens and other social misfits get penalized for operating outside the bounds of social laws. It doesn't matter if you agree. It matters if you're here. Your agreement is entirely unnecessary. And before someone says, well, that's just might makes right. Yes, it is. So nice of you to notice. Because that's really how it works. And I find it hysterical when the religious pull that, because that's exactly what they believe about God. God is all-powerful, therefore God gets to make the rules. But, the religious are hypocrites.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
All right.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't because people like Frank really don't live in the real world, or at least they pretend they don't, because the real world is far too scary and confusing a place. So they invent gods to watch over them and rules to live by, and then they place the origin of those ideas far beyond the humans that made them up in the first place to keep anyone from being able to question or change them in the future. And people like Frank fall for it, hook, line, and sinker, both because it's all he's ever known, but also because the alternative is far too difficult for him to consider. Because not buying into this absurd universal moral system, the universal moral system no one can agree on, but everyone is convinced that they, and only they, have it right, means that you actually have to think for yourself. You actually have to decide what's important to you and to the people around you. You have to understand and operate under enlightened self-interest and be able to comprehend how your actions impact others and how theirs impact you. And there's going to be disagreement, and you have to figure out how to compromise and get the greatest number of people to agree to support the most reasonable set of social rules. And you're not going to get your way on everything. I think that's what frightens these people the most, that their religion will not dictate socially acceptable moral standards. They want to be in charge, but increasingly they're not, mostly because we know exactly what happens when they're in charge, and it doesn't tend to end well for anyone not on their team. Frank just doesn't get it, and that's hardly a surprise. Frank doesn't really seem to get anything. I've seen Frank called one of the most laughable apologists out there. And if I didn't think they were all idiots, I might agree. But they are. And that makes all of religion downright pathetic.
Bum